October 1944. A recently captured town near Metz, France. Mud clings to the boots of exhausted infantrymen who are currently digging defensive trenches into the cold earth. The sound of distant artillery echoes through the gray sky, a reminder that the German front line sits a mere 3 miles away. Suddenly, a convoy of clean, heated vehicles arrives, bringing a civilian film crew carrying heavy cameras and tripods. The director looks around, shakes his head, and demands that an entire combat company pull back out of their positions. He wants them to march back into the town from the west with flags flying and engines roaring. Because he missed the actual fight and needs better footage for the theaters back home. General George S. Patton will soon deliver an unmistakable reality check to this Hollywood intrusion. This is the story of what Patton did when a Hollywood director wanted to pull combat troops to reshoot a liberation. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when the enemy wore a suit instead of a uniform. Captain Robert Kim was a 27-year-old company commander from Seattle, Washington, serving in the 2nd Infantry Regiment of the 5th Infantry Division. Before the war, he worked as a civil engineer, designing concrete foundations and steel bridges. He enlisted the morning after Pearl Harbor, leaving behind his parents and a younger sister. He had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, watched his closest childhood friend die in a mortar barrage outside St. Lo, and carried the physical scars of shrapnel in his right shoulder. His men were tired, cold, and desperately needed rest after days of brutal street fighting. He understood that a single mistake in placement could mean the annihilation of his entire unit. On this rainy afternoon, he found himself staring at an official piece of paper that ordered him to endanger those very men for the sake of a camera lens. Major Jack Harmon was a 38-year-old War Department liaison from Los Angeles, California. Back home, he was a powerful studio executive who wore tailored wool suits, drove a luxury coupe, and decided which scripts became silver-screen blockbusters. Now, he wore a pristine, custom-tailored officer uniform, without a speck of mud or grease on the fabric, complemented by gleaming, highly polished leather boots. Harmon viewed the European theater not as a deadly, grinding conflict, but as a massive, government-funded studio backlot meant to produce thrilling footage for the public. He firmly believed that combat existed to look magnificent and inspiring on theater screens across America. To him, real military tactics were secondary to visual composition, lighting angles, and dramatic flair. He had already disrupted 5 combat operations in the past month to stage dramatic reenactments, treating active battlefields like a Hollywood soundstage. Today, he arrived with a team of civilian cameramen determined to rewrite history by forcing real soldiers to simulate a victory they had already achieved at the cost of blood. By October 1944, the Allied advance across Europe had slowed down significantly after the lightning-fast rush across France during the summer. The Third Army faced a grueling, bloody campaign to capture the heavily fortified city of Metz, a vital gateway to the German border. The enemy had dug in deeply, using an intricate network of reinforced concrete bunkers, underground tunnels, and heavy artillery forts to halt the American momentum. Supply lines were stretched to their absolute limits across hundreds of miles of liberated territory, leaving frontline units short on fuel, cold weather gear, and ammunition. Every inch of ground gained was paid for with lives, and the defensive perimeters around recently captured towns were incredibly volatile. In this high-stakes environment, coordination between adjacent units was absolutely critical to preventing sudden German counterattacks. Division commanders were forced to stretch their depleted manpower thin, leaving vulnerable gaps that required constant vigilance and razor-sharp focus. Despite these life-or-death realities, a strange parallel war was taking place behind the front lines, driven by bureaucrats and public relations coordinators. Senior officers at higher headquarters back in Washington frequently tolerated unusual requests from visiting dignitaries, politicians, and media teams to boost domestic morale. They often allowed film crews to roam through active sectors, believing that spectacular theater newsreels were worth minor operational disruptions. These civilian crews operated with broad authorizations that created friction with frontline officers who were focused entirely on keeping their men alive. This dangerous collision between public relations and military reality came to a head on the muddy outskirts of Metz. Major Harmon stepped into the makeshift command tent and unrolled a large, map-sized shooting schedule across the wooden table. Captain Kim looked up from his field radio, his face dark with exhaustion. "Major, I cannot pull my men back to the western ridge," Captain Kim said. Harmon adjusted the crisp cuffs of his uniform. "The War Department approved this documentary project, Captain. We need to capture the liberation from a fresh angle. My company took this town yesterday at the cost of 12 casualties," Captain Kim said. "We are exactly 3 miles from the German line. If I move my men, it leaves a massive gap in our defense." Harmon smiled smoothly and tapped the paper. "The American public needs to see flags flying and vehicles moving in daylight. Your current positions do not look heroic on film. The enemy does not care about your camera angles. Major," Captain Kim said, "if they counterattack while we are playing actors, my men will be caught in the open. This film is for national morale." "Captain," Harmon said, "morale wins wars just as much as bullets do. Washington expects cooperation. I answer to the Third Army Command, not to a Hollywood studio," Captain Kim said. "My orders are to hold this flank." Major Harmon leaned over the table, his polished boots clicking together. "Let me remind you of my rank, Captain. I am a major representing the War Department. You are a captain holding up a vital national project because you are stubborn. Your project is putting lives at risk for a fake story," Captain Kim said. "It is not fake, it is historical recreation," Harmon answered. "I have ordered 5 of these reshoots this month with other units." No one else complained about a little extra marching for the cameras. Those officers did not have an active artillery battery zeroed in on their position, Captain Kim said. "I refuse to expose my men to artillery fire, just so you can get a better wide shot." Harmon sneered, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "You will obey this directive, Captain. Your men will pack their gear, march 2 miles back to the road, and re-enter this town with flags flying. If you refuse, I will personally see to it that your military career ends in a court-martial for insubordination." Captain Kim stood up slowly, keeping his hands flat on the table to hide his anger. He looked at the studio executive-turned-officer, realizing that arguing was completely useless. The man could not see past his own lens. "Understood, Major," Captain Kim said. "I am notifying headquarters immediately." Captain Kim walked over to the field telephone, gripped the receiver tightly, and called the high command. He reported the situation, the threat to the defensive line, and the major's explicit demands directly up the chain of command. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up directly outside the command tent, its tires throwing up thick sheets of dark, watery mud. 4 silver stars gleamed brightly on his helmet, and the ivory handles of his revolvers rested against his hips in the cold afternoon light. The entire room went completely silent the exact moment he walked inside. He did not slam the door, and he did not raise his voice. He simply stood at the edge of the wooden table and fixed his eyes on the pristine uniform of the movie executive. "Are you Major Harmon?" Patton asked. "I am, General," Harmon said, stepping forward with a confident smile. "I am glad you are here to clear up this misunderstanding with the captain." "Did you order a company of combat infantrymen to leave their defensive lines?" Patton asked. "I requested their assistance to capture vital footage for the National Morale documentary," Harmon answered. "Did you understand that their absence would create a 6-mile gap in our frontline defense?" Patton asked. Harmon shrugged slightly, his polished boots shifting on the dirt floor. "I am not a tactical officer, General, but Washington explicitly authorized this project. Morale wins wars, too. Patton stepped closer, his voice remaining low, controlled, and utterly freezing. "You come into my sector wearing a clean uniform that has never seen a day of real hardship. You stand inside a tent 3 miles from a hostile artillery battery and talk about Washington authorizations as if paper can stop a bullet. You think this war is a theater production, where you can yell 'cut' and reset the stage whenever the lighting changes. You believe that history exists to look handsome on a screen for people sitting in comfortable chairs back home. Yesterday, Captain Kim and his men crawled through the mud of this town to clear out machine gun nests and bury their dead friends. They did not do it for a camera angle, and they did not do it for your personal career advancement. They did it to advance the line. My soldiers are trained to kill the enemy and survive the winter, not to act as understudies for your Hollywood actors. If I pull them from that ridge for 6 hours, the Germans will take this town back before your film can even reach the processing lab. You have a choice. You can pack your heavy cameras, step away from my frontline units, and film the next real battle from behind the supply lines without moving a single vehicle, or you can take off that clean uniform, grab a standard rifle, and sit in a defensive trench yourself for the next 48 hours to see exactly what combat looks like. Decide now." Major Harmon stared at the general, his mouth opening slightly as the confidence completely drained from his face. He looked at the ivory revolvers, then at the hard line of Patton's jaw, and realized that his studio titles meant absolutely nothing in the Third Army. He slowly lowered his head. Major Harmon chose to pack up his equipment and immediately withdraw his crew from the sector. Captain Kim watched as the civilian film technicians loaded the heavy metal tripods, lenses, and camera bodies back into the wooden crates. The general stood beside the command tent, his gloved hands resting near his ivory revolvers, monitoring the entire process until the vehicles were loaded. The Hollywood director looked down at his pristine, unsoiled leather boots. Avoiding the gaze of the mud-covered infantrymen, who were returning to their shovel work in the cold rain. As the convoy rolled away from the western ridge, the sound of their engines was quickly swallowed by the familiar, distant thud of German artillery fire coming from the hills 3 miles away. The soldiers of the 2nd Infantry Regiment watched the trucks disappear down the muddy road toward the rear supply lines. Knowing that their defensive line remained secure and unbroken, Patton did not wait for the vehicles to clear the area before boarding his open jeep and departing for the next command post. The field telephone remained silent, and the 6-hour gap that would have exposed the entire flank was never created. Captain Robert Kim returned to Seattle, Washington, after the war concluded in 1945. He resumed his professional career as a structural engineer, eventually helping to build the expanding highway systems of the Pacific Northwest. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and lived a quiet, productive civilian life until his peaceful passing in 1993. For decades, he kept a small, tarnished brass buckle from a field radio case on his study desk, as a private reminder of the day his company stood its ground near Metz. Major Jack Harmon returned to Los Angeles, California in the late summer of 1945 following a quiet reassignment to a domestic administrative depot. He went back to his position as a film studio executive, but his influence within the industry steadily declined as post-war audiences demanded gritty, realistic portrayals over staged theatrical propaganda. He spent his final years in bitter retirement, frequently complaining to his associates about military bureaucracy and the lack of artistic appreciation among career officers, until his death in 1974. General George S. Patton never mentioned the incident with the Hollywood film crew in his public briefings or his personal memoirs. He kept the official operational report filed away in his private field desk, alongside notes on fuel shortages and ammunition requests. In a private letter written to a close family friend in late October 1944, he briefly noted that the greatest threat to a soldier's position often came from well-dressed men who believed that the reality of war could be rearranged for a better view. Some historians have argued that the promotion of military actions through public channels was an essential component of the broader war effort back home. They point out that maintaining domestic support across the country required a constant stream of dramatic imagery from the front lines. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that the safety of frontline infantry units should never be compromised for the sake of staged public relations campaigns. They maintain that operational decisions must rest entirely with combat commanders on the ground rather than media consultants. What is certain is that the integrity of the defensive line near Metz remained completely secure because combat realities were prioritized over theatrical productions. If you had been in General Patton's position, would you have done the same thing, or would you have allowed the film crew to shoot their footage from a safer distance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you want more stories about what happened when the enemy wore a suit instead of a uniform, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now.